The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering, the kind of thing that looks expensive but costs nothing to send. Ethan Carter had read it once, set it on the kitchen counter, and then walked past it every single morning without touching it. As if the paper itself carried a low-grade current he wasn't sure he wanted to feel. 20 years since graduation. 20 years since the hallways of Westbrook High. Since the cafeteria. Since the particular cruelty that only teenagers seem capable of producing with such effortless, reliable consistency. He had spent those years building something quieter than most people would recognize as a life not quieter in the defeated sense, but quieter in the way that a deep river is quiet on the surface, while carrying enormous force beneath. Still, on the morning of the reunion, he had stood in front of his bathroom mirror and put on the navy suit, the one he'd worn to his cousin's wedding 6 years ago, the one that still fit but showed its age in the slight dulling of the fabric and the barely perceptible fraying at the cuffs, and he had told himself that he was going because it was the adult thing to do, because 20 years was enough time for everyone to have grown up, because surely the world had changed people the way time was supposed to change people. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. The Grand Meridian Hotel on Michigan Avenue rose 42 floors above the Chicago sidewalk, its glass facade catching the last gray light of an October afternoon. A light mist had settled over the city since noon, the kind of autumn rain that doesn't quite commit to falling, just drifts and clings to everything, to coat lapels, to the steel archway above the entrance, to the hair of the valet attendants, who moved with practiced efficiency under the portico. Ethan parked his truck 3 blocks away rather than let the valet touch it, not out of pride but out of habit. He walked those 3 blocks with his collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, watching the taxis pull away from the hotel entrance, with their wet red taillights smearing across the pavement. He stood on the sidewalk across the street for a moment longer than he intended to, watching the golden glow from the lobby windows, hearing the muted sound of a string quartet through the glass, and he almost turned back. He almost told himself that adulthood did not require this particular form of performance, but something in him, some stubborn, quiet thing that had always refused to give ground to fear, stepped off the curb and crossed the street. The ballroom was on the 3rd floor. Past a registration table staffed by 2 women, Ethan vaguely recognized from homeroom. They smiled the practiced smiles of people who were mostly looking at name tags rather than faces, and one of them said, "Ethan." "Oh, wow. Great to see you," in a tone that suggested she had said that exact sentence perhaps 60 times in the last 2 hours. He took his name tag, affixed it to his jacket lapel, and walked into a room that smelled like catered chicken and expensive perfume, and the specific anxiety of people trying too hard to seem relaxed. The ballroom held perhaps 130 people, a third of whom he recognized immediately, another third distantly, and the final third not at all. Round tables draped in white linen were positioned around a central dance floor, where a few couples had already found the courage to move. A bar ran the length of the far wall, and that was where most of the men had gathered, drinks in hand, doing what men at reunions do, recounting themselves, revising, presenting the version they'd been polishing in the car on the way over. Ryan Brooks was easy to find. He always had been. Even in high school, Ryan had possessed that particular magnetism that has nothing to do with substance and everything to do with volume, the ability to take up space in a room, to draw eyes, to make people orbit him simply because he moved like he expected them to. He was standing near the center of the room with a glass of bourbon, wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly been purchased recently, his hair salted lightly at the temples in a way he probably considered distinguished. He was telling a story that involved his hands, both of them, the bourbon glass tilting at dangerous angles as he illustrated whatever point he was making. 3 men stood around him laughing. 2 women nearby were listening at the edge of his radius. Not quite part of the circle, but not quite outside it either. Ryan had done well enough for himself, a small commercial real estate company with about 20 employees, the kind of business that looks more impressive from the outside than it is. But Ryan had never learned the difference between success and the performance of success, and at 38 he wore that confusion as openly as he wore his suit. He spotted Ethan within 4 minutes of Ethan entering the room. That was fast, But then Ryan had always had a radar for certain people, specifically the ones he'd decided a long time ago were beneath him, because those were the ones whose presence required management. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly when he saw Ethan. Something behind his eyes recalibrated. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Carter," he called out, using the last name the way boys use last names, the way that sounds like familiarity, but contains something else. "Ethan Carter. Still fixing machines for a living?" He said it with a grin that he would describe as friendly if anyone called it out. But Ethan recognized the grin the way you recognize a smell from childhood immediately, in the body before the brain. Several heads turned. A few people nearby chuckled. Not because it was genuinely funny, but because Ryan's grin had given them permission to. Ethan walked toward the bar without hurrying, got himself a glass of water he was driving. And he never drank when he was driving and said, calmly, "Good to see you, Ryan." It was neither a confirmation nor a denial, just a social acknowledgement. The kind of thing you say when you've had 20 years to practice not giving people the reaction they're fishing for. But Ryan hadn't finished casting. He crossed the space between them in a few easy strides. The way confident men move when they've decided the territory is theirs, and clapped Ethan on the shoulder with the heavy hand of false camaraderie. "Seriously though," Ryan said, loud enough for the table nearest them to hear. "What are you up to these days? You were always the smart one in AP Physics. I always figured you'd be running NASA or something." He laughed, and the laugh was specifically calibrated warm enough to seem like a joke, pointed enough to land like a dart. Someone at the nearest table smiled. Ethan looked at Ryan for a moment, reading the familiar map of his face. The lines that time had added without improving anything. And he thought about the question, as if it deserved a real answer, because to Ethan, every question deserved a real answer. "Maintenance engineering," he said. "Industrial systems. Server infrastructure, climate control, power grids for large facilities." Ryan's eyebrows rose in a performance of surprise. "So, like, a repairman?" And the people nearby laughed more openly this time, because Ryan had given them a word repairman that sounded smaller than what Ethan had described, and people at reunions reach for things that make them feel less small themselves. Ryan looked around at his audience, pleased, and said, "Come on, man. Tell us your biggest success story. Give us something." And the room waited to see what Ethan Carter would do with that. What Ethan did was nothing. Not quite nothing. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and let the silence sit there for a moment. Unhurried, the way a man sits in silence when he has nothing to prove. Then he said, "Still working on it," which was technically true and also so modest that it offered Ryan nothing useful to build on. But Ryan didn't need material. Ryan had always been able to build from thin air. He turned to the group that had gathered, and it had grown, because nothing draws a crowd at a reunion like the scent of social tension, and said, "You guys remember Ethan, right? Smartest guy in our class, swear to God, had a perfect score on the physics final junior year." He paused. Now he fixes the air conditioning. The laughter was fuller this time. Ethan felt it the way you feel cold water immediately, throughout the body, but nothing changed in his face. He'd been feeling that particular cold for 20 years, and he had learned, long ago, that warming yourself by other people's fires was a transaction with terms he didn't like. He set down his water glass and said, quietly, "Good to see you, Ryan," for the second time, which was both true and final. And he began to step away from the group. He almost made it. He was 3 steps from the bar, 2 steps from a comfortable corner where he could spend an hour talking to people who actually interested him and then leave at a reasonable time, when Ryan's voice followed him like a hand on the collar. "Hold on, Carter, don't run off," he called. And it was the word run that did it, not to Ethan, who didn't react, but to the room, because it reframed stepping away as retreat, as avoidance, and once a room believes that story, it's very hard to put back in the bottle. "Come on, sit with us. Tell us about the divorce." He said it with that same grin. "How's the single dad life treating you?" That one landed differently. And Ryan knew it would, because Ryan had always known which knives cut deepest. The laughter that came was slightly softer. This time there were people in the room who were divorced themselves, who heard the edge in the joke and felt it in their own ribs, but enough people laughed, enough people looked. And Ethan stopped walking. Not because he was hurt, exactly, though he was, the way you are when something you've worked hard to carry, without complaint, gets held up as evidence of failure in front of a crowd. Because he was deciding something. His hands, in his pockets, were absolutely still. And his breathing was the deliberate, even breathing of a man who has practiced exactly this. The practice of not giving the moment what it's demanding of him. He turned around slowly and looked at Ryan with the kind of look that doesn't announce itself as anything, not anger, not sadness, not the wounded outrage that Ryan was hoping for. Just pure, clean attention. And for a moment, Ryan held that gaze, and something passed between them that the rest of the room couldn't quite name. It was the thing that passes between a person who needs an audience and a person who doesn't need anything from the room. Then Ethan said, "The single dad life is exactly what it is, Ryan. It's raising a kid. I like it." And he meant it, which was the thing Ryan couldn't understand, because Ryan had never said anything he completely meant, and genuine contentment was so foreign to him that he could only read it as defeat. But Ryan was in front of an audience, and audiences require maintenance. He pressed on. He had a gift for escalation, or he called it a gift, though the more accurate word was addiction. He said, loud and warm and terrible. "What does a maintenance guy clear in a month? Like $5 grand? $5,000? He let that hang in the air. Rhetorical, performed. I spent more than that on the rims on my car. More laughter, loose and easy, the kind that people produce when they want to belong to the side that seems to be winning. Someone near the back made a sound, half laugh, half wince, and Ethan recognized it as the sound of people who know something is wrong but don't want to be the one to say so. He looked at the room, at these people who had been his classmates, who had shared hallways and homerooms and 1,000 small moments of adolescent time, and he felt something he had felt before, not quite loneliness, not quite contempt, more like a careful sadness for the fact that 20 years had not been enough for some people, that some people come to a reunion not to reconnect but to re-establish a hierarchy they've been missing. He took a breath. He said, quietly, "Enough to live well. That's enough for me." Ryan smiled at the room like a man laying down a winning hand, picked up his bourbon, and said, "Gentlemen, I would like to propose a toast to Ethan Carter, the most honest answer any of us will hear tonight." He raised his glass. The man who peaked in AP Physics and never looked back. Ethan didn't pick up his water glass. He didn't move. He let the toast hang in the air. And then he said, simply and without drama, "I'm going to get some air." He set his glass on the nearest table, with the precise, careful movement of someone who has learned to be deliberate with his hands. And he walked toward the exit. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just walking. The way a man walks when he's decided that a room no longer requires his presence. The crowd parted in that slightly awkward way crowds part when they're not sure whether what just happened was funny or something else. A woman near the bar, Maggie, he thought, Maggie Okafor from AP English, who had sat 3 seats ahead of him for 3 years, caught his eye as he passed, and her expression was the expression of someone who wants to say something and doesn't know how. He gave her a small nod and kept walking. Because he wasn't angry. Not exactly, and he didn't need anyone to apologize on his behalf. He had learned, somewhere in the long middle passage of his adult life, that your dignity is not something other people can take from you. It's something you either carry or you don't, and Ethan had been carrying his for a very long time. He pushed through the door into the wide, carpeted corridor, and then further, through a side door and onto a small terrace that looked out over the side street below, where the mist had thickened slightly and the streetlights made orange halos in the damp air. He stood at the railing with his hands wrapped around the cold metal and let the city noise settle over him, a taxi horn 2 blocks away, the low percussion of a delivery truck, the wet hiss of traffic on Michigan Avenue. and he breathed it in because the night air was honest, in a way the ballroom had not been, and he needed something honest right now. He thought about leaving entirely, about walking the 3 blocks to his truck and driving home. And the thought was genuinely appealing. Not because he was defeated, but because the cost-benefit of staying had become unclear to him. He was still calculating when, from the street below, he heard a sound that didn't belong to the ambient noise of a Chicago October evening, the low, deliberate purr of multiple car engines moving in coordinated silence. An engine note that was too controlled, too matched to belong to ordinary traffic, the particular sound of vehicles that move in convoy. He looked down. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows were pulling to the curb with the measured precision of a motorcade. They were not police vehicles, no markings, no lights. They were the kind of vehicles that belong to people who have decided that their time is valuable enough to warrant the infrastructure. The lead vehicle stopped first, and a man in a dark suit stepped out from the passenger side before the engine had fully settled, positioning himself at the rear door with the practiced efficiency of someone who does this many times a day. The door opened, and Victoria Bennett stepped out onto the Michigan Avenue sidewalk, wearing a coat the color of charcoal and moving the way she always moved, with the particular economy of motion of someone who has never needed to fill space to command it. Back inside the ballroom, the mood had resumed its surface normalcy, the music, the clinking glasses, the accumulated noise of 130 people eating catered chicken and revising themselves. Ryan had moved back to the center of his orbit, accepting congratulations for the toast from people who laughed, because laughing was easier than thinking about it. The door opening barely registered at first, but there was something about the way the hotel staff reacted, the front desk manager straightening visibly, the waitstaff near the door stepping back almost unconsciously, the way the room's ambient attention seemed to rotate, slowly, toward the entrance that caused people to turn and look. Victoria Bennett crossed the ballroom threshold, with 2 members of her personal staff flanking her at a discreet distance, and in the moment that she entered, something changed in the room, not dramatically, not loudly, but the way things change when someone walks into a space and the space understands, without being told, that the geometry has shifted. She was not in evening wear. She wore a charcoal suit with clean, severe lines that suited her the way architecture suits a skyline, not decorative, structural. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face in the manner of someone who had been working until an hour ago and had made exactly the adjustments she considered necessary. She looked like what she was, a woman who ran a company with 11,000 employees and $4 billion in annual revenue, and who had arrived here tonight by choice, which meant she had chosen this, which meant something. Ryan Brooks processed her entrance and did what Ryan always did, located the person of highest status in any room and attempted to establish connection. He was already moving toward the entrance when Victoria's eyes swept the ballroom and stopped. They stopped at Ethan Carter, not at Ryan, not at the bar or the dance floor or the high-top tables where the most socially energized people of the evening had congregated. At Ethan Carter, who was just walking back in from the terrace, his jacket slightly damp at the shoulders from the mist, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has spent a few minutes alone and found it restorative rather than sad. Victoria's eyes found him, and something in her face changed the way water changes when light hits it, not dramatically, but completely. She moved in his direction, and the 2 members of her staff followed at their discreet distance, and Ryan Brooks watched this happen and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the particular vertigo of realizing that the room he thought he understood had a different floor plan than he'd assumed. Ethan saw her when she was about 20 feet away. His reaction was not what the room expected. He didn't straighten up, didn't adjust his jacket, didn't perform the minor, involuntary primping that most people execute when someone powerful approaches. He just looked at her with the same open, uncomplicated attention that he gave everyone. And he said, when she was close enough to hear, "You didn't have to come." Victoria said, "I know." She stopped in front of him. She was a few inches shorter than him, and she looked up at him with an expression that most of the people in the room had never seen on her face in any photograph or press appearance, something unguarded, something that chose to be where it was. Without breaking that look, she reached up and adjusted the knot of his tie with 2 careful fingers, a gesture so casually intimate that it silenced the nearest dozen people before the silence spread outward through the room, like a dropped stone in still water. Then she said, "To him and to no one else, and to everyone. He's with me." 3 words. Quiet and absolute. The ballroom absorbed them, the way dry ground absorbs rain all at once, completely, with nowhere for the excess to go. Ryan Brooks had arrived at the edge of this moment during the 2 seconds of frozen quiet that followed. He stood there with his bourbon glass tilted at the same angle it had been when he was telling stories an hour ago. And for the first time that evening, possibly for the first time in many years, he had nothing to say. He was a man who had built his entire adult social architecture on the ability to say something quick, something that moved the temperature of a room, something that reasserted the version of himself he was most comfortable presenting. The absence of any such something was disorienting in a way he couldn't quite locate in his body. Victoria did not look at him. She looked only at Ethan, and she said, softly, "Are you all right?" And Ethan said, "I am now." Which was not quite a statement about the evening, and was not quite a statement about the longer duration of things, and was perhaps both the evening and the longer duration of things, and the specific relief of having someone choose your side in a room full of people who hadn't. Victoria nodded once, the way she nodded when something had been handled. Then, and only then, did she turn her attention to the wider room, and it settled on Ryan Brooks the way a searchlight settles on a particular section of darkness, not aggressive, but inexorable. Ryan cleared his throat. He produced his best version of confident composure, which was considerably less impressive than it had been 20 minutes ago. "Miss Bennett," he said, because even he understood that he could not call her Victoria. "I wasn't aware that you and Ethan were." He searched for the word and couldn't find one that didn't expose him. "Acquainted," he settled on. Victoria allowed the word to exist in the air for a moment. Then she said, "Most people aren't." She said it pleasantly, the way you state a fact of geography. And then, without any shift in her composure, she said, "Ethan has been with Bennett Technologies for nearly 3 years. In that time, he has prevented 4 critical infrastructure failures in our primary data centers, any one of which could have cost the company between $30 and $80 million per incident." She said it conversationally, as one might mention a colleague's useful habit. "He designed a modified cooling redundancy protocol that our engineering team had been trying to solve for 6 years. He solved it in 11 days. Ryan's bourbon glass had very slowly descended during this recitation until his arm was at his side, and the glass was hanging from 2 fingers. The people nearby were very still. Maggie Okafor had moved closer. Several people who had been at the bar were now simply standing, listening, because Victoria Bennett was speaking, and Victoria Bennett said exactly as many words as she intended to say and not one more, which meant every word was worth catching. "I am not aware of what was said earlier this evening," Victoria continued, and her tone didn't change, didn't harden, but something in the room knew that this was not quite true, or was true only technically. "But I will say this about Ethan Carter." She paused, not for drama, but because she was choosing carefully. "In my professional experience, which is now 17 years, I have met perhaps 4 people who are genuinely irreplaceable. Not because of title, not because of the size of their office, or the number of people who report to them, because of what they carry in their head and what they carry in their character. And because those 2 things happen to be exactly aligned. Ethan is one of the 4. Ryan Brooks stood there with his bourbon in his hand, and the smile gone from his face. And around him the people who had laughed redistributed their weight the way people do when they are quietly reassessing something. A man near the bar set down his drink. A woman at the nearest table stopped mid-sentence. The string quartet, which had been playing a subdued jazz standard, reached the end of a phrase and paused. And in that pause, the silence in the room was complete and clarifying, the way silence gets when something real has been said in it. Ethan had not moved during any of this. He stood beside Victoria with his hands at his sides, not uncomfortable, not performing discomfort, simply present, the way he was always simply present, occupying his exact dimensions in the world, without apology or advertisement. Someone near the back said, quietly. I didn't know that. And it wasn't clear whether they meant the engineering, or the irreplaceability, or something more private, something to do with what they had laughed at 20 minutes ago. And the feeling that was now sitting in their chest because of it. Ryan looked at Ethan. He could not look directly, he looked at the middle space between them, the way you look at something bright. He said carefully, "Victoria, I apologize if I..." And she said, without sharpness, without theater, "You'd be apologizing to the wrong person." Ryan looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. And between them was 20 years of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't, and the particular weight of a moment in which the person who had always held the power in a dynamic was no longer holding it. But there was still more the room didn't know. Victoria turned to Ethan and said, with something that, in another person, might have been called mischief, "Should I tell them the rest?" Ethan said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know." And she told them. 3 years ago, she said, when Ethan had been with the company for perhaps 4 months, she had seen something that had changed her assessment of him from excellent engineer to something harder to categorize. The company's main data center in the western region had experienced a cascading failure at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, the kind of failure that the automated systems were not designed to handle, because it combined 3 simultaneous anomalies that had each, in isolation, a probability of less than 1%. The on-call team had called the emergency number. The emergency number had escalated. She had been on a red-eye from London and landed at O'Hare at 5:30 in the morning to a phone full of messages about projected losses that had grown from 12 million to 40 million in the time it took her to taxi to the gate. By the time she reached the facility, Ethan had been there for 2 hours. He had diagnosed the failure, implemented a manual bypass that the system documentation said could not be implemented without shutting everything down, and kept the critical servers online. The loss, which had been projected at 40 million when she landed, was ultimately under 2 million. She had walked into the server room at 6:15 in the morning and found Ethan sitting on the floor against the server rack with a cup of coffee from the vending machine and a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten calculation, and she had said something executive-ish about exceptional performance, and he had said, "The pad is for you. I wrote down everything I did so you can update the protocol." That was it. No performance. No awareness that he had just saved the company from a catastrophe. Just the yellow pad, held out to her, because the documentation needed updating. That was the story that Victoria told in the ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel on a Thursday evening in October, and she told it in her even, precise voice, and when she finished, the room was quiet, in a way that rooms are rarely quiet, not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of something settling. Maggie Okafor was the first to speak. She said, "Ethan, I'm sorry. Not sorry in the vague, reflexive way people apologize at reunions. Sorry in the direct, specific way of someone who has identified a debt and wants to pay it. I should have said something tonight. Earlier." Ethan looked at her. "You don't owe me anything, Maggie," he said, and meant it. But she shook her head and said, "Yes, I do." And the honesty of it, the small, costly honesty of saying I was wrong in a room full of people, was its own kind of quiet courage, and Ethan recognized it and was glad for it. 3 or 4 others, seeing Maggie, found their own small honesty and offered it. The man who had laughed, loudest at the toast, put down his drink and said, "That wasn't right. The toast. I shouldn't have laughed." Someone else said, "Same," and the laughter that had been so easy an hour ago became something different when you looked at it from where they were standing now. Ryan Brooks was standing slightly to the side of all of this, in the geography of a man who has been moved to the margin. He was not drunk, exactly, but he had had enough bourbon that his face had lost its practiced polish, and what was underneath was more readable than he usually allowed. He watched the room shift, watched Victoria, watched Ethan, watched the people who had been his audience become something else, and he felt, perhaps for the first time in 20 years, the particular cold of understanding what it means to have spent 20 years being confident you were the right kind of person, and then encountering evidence to the contrary in a public room. He set down his glass on the nearest surface. He straightened his jacket, not because it needed straightening, but because his hands needed something to do. He walked through the room toward Ethan, and it was a different kind of walk than his earlier one, not the easy, territorial walk of a man claiming space, but the careful walk of a man crossing uncertain ground. He stopped in front of Ethan and extended his hand. His expression contained something that was not quite humility. Ryan Brooks at 38 was not capable of complete humility. The machinery required for it had been left undeveloped for too long, but it contained something real. The closest word might be acknowledgement. The recognition that a version of reality he'd been carrying for 20 years had just been shown to be a smaller and shabbier thing than the actual reality, and that the person standing in front of him had known this all along, and had never once thrown it in his face. Ethan looked at the hand. He looked at Ryan. He took the hand and shook it. Firm, brief, complete. He said, "We've both grown up, Ryan." "That counts for something," Ryan said. "Yeah, and then, with the transparency of someone who has just run out of performance, yeah, I think it does." He didn't say anything else. He didn't try to explain or qualify or reframe. He just nodded once and stepped back, and in doing so he demonstrated the only genuinely adult thing he'd done all evening. Victoria, who was watching this from 3 feet away, said nothing, but Ethan, who had known her for 3 years, caught the slight change in her expression, something fractionally warmer, fractionally more confirmed and understood, that she was filing this away in the private ledger she kept on human behavior, the one she consulted when she needed to know who people actually were, rather than who they presented themselves as being. Victoria said to Ethan, quietly, "Come up with me for a moment." She said it to him. Just to him. But in a room that had become very attentive to both of them, people heard it. She moved toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, where the microphone stood unused near the band. And Ethan followed her because she had asked, and because, in 3 years of working together, he had learned that when Victoria moved toward something it was generally worth following. She stepped onto the low stage and stood before the microphone with the natural composure of someone who has given keynote addresses in rooms 5 times this size. She didn't tap the microphone or clear her throat or perform any of the small rituals of a person seeking attention. She simply stood there, and the room came to her, because it always did. She waited until she had the full silence. And then she said, "I want to say one thing, and then I'll get out of your reunion." A few people smiled. She said, "I've been building companies for 17 years. I've hired MBAs from the best programs in the world, executives with long titles and longer compensation packages, people who give presentations that could move the stock price 10 points and look extraordinary on paper. And I've learned, more slowly than I should have, that a company is not built by the people who know how to describe what they do. It's built by the people who show up, who go quiet when it matters, who carry the weight of the work without needing the weight of the recognition." She paused. "Ethan Carter has never given me a presentation. He has given me yellow legal pads with handwritten notes, and because of him, and a handful of people like him, there are $40 million in assets sitting safe on servers right now, instead of being written off in a press release." She looked out at the room, at all of it, and she said, "The most valuable people in any room are rarely the loudest ones in it." She stepped back from the microphone, and the room held still for one long breath, and then the applause started, not the polite, social applause of a managed event, but the real kind, the kind that comes from people who have been genuinely moved by something they didn't expect. It began near the back, where people who hadn't been close enough to hear everything clearly had nevertheless felt the room shift, and it spread forward to the tables near the stage, and it became the kind of sustained, standing applause that a room like that produces only when something true has been said in it. Ethan stood beside her on the stage, and absorbed this with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, not uncomfortable, not dismissive, not performing modesty, just present. His hands hung at his sides. He looked out at his former classmates, at people he hadn't seen in 20 years, at the faces of people who had watched Ryan mock him an hour ago, and who were now in the particular grace that sometimes appears in groups of people when a room gives them permission to be better than their defaults, choosing to be something different. He saw Maggie Okafor standing at her table, with both hands pressed together. He saw the man who had laughed at the toast standing with his palms together and his eyes aimed at the floor, which was its own kind of honesty. He saw Ryan Brooks sitting in a chair near the wall, slightly apart from everyone, not clapping, not clapping, just sitting with his bourbon untouched on the table beside him, and his face doing the private work of revision that no one can help you with. After, the evening unwound in the gradual, organic way that evenings unwind when the main event has already happened. People ate and drank, and talked with the loosened quality of people who have been through something together and emerged. Victoria moved through the room with Ethan at her side, not as a performance, not as a statement, just because they were talking. The way they always talked, easily and specifically, and with the kind of conversational rhythm that develops between people who have spent enough hours solving things together that they've learned each other's frequencies. She introduced him to two people she'd run into, who turned out to have mutual professional acquaintances. He told her something about the building's HVAC system that he'd noticed walking in, which made her laugh quietly. In that way she had not quite a full laugh, more like a contained sound that acknowledged something had been genuinely funny. And people who passed near them noticed this and noted it, not because it was romantic in any obvious sense, but because there was something in it that was warmer and more real than the professional relationship Victoria presented to the world, something that suggested the 17 floors of formality between them were thinner than they looked. The reunion thinned as 10 o'clock became 11. As people with babysitters and early flights gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, Ryan left an hour before the end. Quietly, with a nod to the room and no particular ceremony, his car was brought around, and he sat in the back, and his driver took him home, and he was alone with himself in the dark back seat for the 40-minute drive north, which was possibly the longest he had been alone with himself in a very long time. He did not call anyone. He did not reconstruct the evening in a version more favorable to himself. Or not immediately. Not yet. He just sat and watched the lights go by, and let the evening be what it had been, which was the first honest thing he'd done all night. By 11:30, the ballroom was half empty. The string quartet had packed up. The hotel staff were beginning the quiet choreography of cleanup, the lifting of glasses, the folding of linens, the dimming of lights. Ethan said goodnight to the last few people who came to find him. Maggie Okafor, who hugged him briefly and said she would send him a message because she meant it and wanted him to know she meant it. A man named Davis, who had sat across from him in AP chemistry, and who said, "You were always the real one, man. I always knew that," which Ethan received with gratitude because Davis said it with his whole face and not just his mouth. Victoria said her goodnights to the hotel manager and to the two members of her staff, who materialized like discrete planets when she moved toward the exit. She paused at the door and looked back at Ethan and said, "Walk out with me." It was the same tone as before, not a command, not quite a question, just an expression of what she wanted, offered to him cleanly. He said, "Sure." And they walked out together. The side terrace door let them out onto the small street that ran along the hotel's north face, away from the main entrance and the remaining valets, and the October air was cold and damp, and genuinely present in a way that indoor air never is. The mist had graduated to a light rain, the kind that falls almost sideways in Chicago in October, thin as gauze and twice as persistent. Victoria looked up at it for a moment, then at the street, then at Ethan, and she said, "I owe you an apology." Ethan said, "For what?" She said, "For not being here earlier. I knew what these things can be like." He looked at her. "You couldn't have known it would go like that." "I knew Ryan Brooks was going to be there," she said. "You told me his name when you mentioned the reunion 2 months ago. I looked him up." She said it without particular expression, just fact. "And I had a call tonight. I should have pushed earlier. I should have been here at 8. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were here when it mattered." And he said it in a way that was also true about other things, about the 3 years of work, about the way she had learned to see him what he was and wasn't, what he needed and didn't, and she heard all of those layers in it and chose to answer the top one and leave the others there between them, like furniture in a room both people knew was shared. "Still," she said. He said, "Victoria," and she stopped and looked at him because he almost never said her name. He said, "Thank you." Just that. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. And then she said, very quietly, "You're welcome, Ethan." And they stood there in the light rain, on the side street, with the city doing what Chicago does in October, glowing orange and cold and indifferent, in all the ways that make it beautiful, and neither of them moved to end it. They walked 2 blocks without deciding to. Just walked. The way people walk when they are in the middle of a conversation that hasn't quite named itself. Victoria said something about the HVAC observation he'd made going in, which led to a conversation about a project she was considering at the Denver facility, which led, as their conversations often did, somewhere else entirely, to a book she was reading about systems theory, to a question he had about a piece of equipment she'd sourced last spring, to a moment of shared silence at a crosswalk where they stood side by side and watched the light change twice before either of them moved to cross. The rain was heavier now, and Ethan's jacket was damp across the shoulders, and Victoria's charcoal coat was holding up better but not by much. He said, "We should get back," she said. "Probably." Neither of them turned around. They crossed the street. The city lights made the wet pavement look like a mirror, doubling everything, and they walked in the doubled world for another half block before she said, without looking at him, "You know that offer still stands, the technical director position." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not pressuring you." He said, "I know that too." A pause, long enough for a full breath. Then he said, "Ask me again at the end of the year." And she looked at him, and he was looking straight ahead, and the corner of his mouth had moved slightly in the way that served him as a smile. And she said, "I'll put it in the calendar." And that was how they left it, not resolved, not closed, but open in the particular way that things are open when both people are interested in where they go. The car was waiting at the end of the block. The driver was patient and professional, and gave no indication that his employer was standing in the rain talking to a man in a damp suit jacket. Victoria stopped at the car door. She looked at Ethan and said, "Get home safe." He said, "You too." The driver opened the door. She was about to get in, and then she didn't. For just a moment, she stood there with one hand on the car roof and looked at Ethan with the same expression she'd had in the ballroom when she adjusted his tie, that unguarded thing that she saved for very few people, and perhaps for him more than she fully acknowledged. And she said, "I'm glad you went tonight." He said, "I almost didn't." She said, "I know." And she got in the car, and the car pulled away, and he stood on the wet sidewalk, watching the tail lights move down the block and turn the corner and disappear into Chicago. And he stood there for a moment longer because he wanted to, because the evening deserved a moment of completion before he moved forward from it. He walked back to his truck with his hands in his pockets. The 3 blocks were the same 3 blocks he'd walked 3 hours ago. Same wet pavement, same orange streetlights. Same city doing its city thing around him, but something was different, not dramatically, not in the cinematic way that stories sometimes describe as transformation, but in the quiet, structural way that things shift when a weight you've been carrying for a long time is redistributed, when something you thought required constant protection reveals itself as capable of standing on its own. He was 38 years old. He had been divorced for 5 years and was, by any external measure, living a smaller life than many of the people he'd sat with tonight. He drove a truck that had 160,000 miles on it, and a suit that had been to one wedding and many fewer places since. He made exactly enough money to live well, which he had told Ryan Brooks, and meant he had a daughter who called him every Wednesday and Saturday, and who had his eyes and his stubborn, quiet disposition, and who at 11 years old had recently told him, with the unerring accuracy of children who haven't yet learned to cushion truth, that he was the most interesting person she knew. He had work that he loved, In the genuine sense, not the performative sense. Not the sense of work as identity marker, but the sense of finding something genuinely engaging in the physical and intellectual texture of complex systems, in the satisfaction of a problem solved and documented, and left better than you found it. He had, tonight, been publicly mocked and publicly vindicated, neither of which had changed the core of who he was, which was perhaps the most important thing he knew about himself. He got into the truck. He sat for a moment before starting it, looking at the rain on the windshield, at the lights it made of everything. He thought about the yellow legal pad he kept in his bag, which currently contained notes on a heat exchanger reconfiguration for the Midwest hub, because he'd had an idea on the drive over and had pulled over briefly to write it down. He thought about the end of the year, which Victoria had put in her calendar. He thought about Maggie Okafor saying I should have said something, and the way it had cost her something real to say it, and how that cost was actually the measure of its value. He thought about Ryan Brooks in the back of a car going north, and he felt something for him that he had felt in high school, and never quite named, not pity, not contempt, something closer to the particular sadness of watching someone spend enormous energy, becoming the wrong version of themselves, someone who mistakes the architecture for the building, and the title for the person, and the loudness for the truth. He started the truck. The engine turned over with its familiar, low note. He put it in drive and pulled out into the wet street, and joined the flow of Chicago at 11:30 on a Thursday in October, moving east, then north, heading home. There is a kind of strength that declares itself. It arrives with a raised voice, with the assertion of rank, with the managed impression. It requires maintenance constant. Exhausting maintenance, because it exists only in relation to other people's perception, and the moment the perception shifts, it begins to leak. There is another kind that simply exists. It doesn't arrive anywhere. It doesn't need to. It is there in the yellow legal pad handed over at 6 in the morning in a server room. It is there in the even voice, saying enough to live well. It is there in the handshake offered to the man who mocked you. Not because you've forgotten, but because you've outgrown the need for him to be different than he is. Ethan Carter drove north, through the Chicago rain, and the city lights held the dark at bay, the way they always do, imperfectly, beautifully, enough and ahead of him. The road opened up the way roads do when you're heading somewhere familiar, somewhere that holds the ordinary shape of your life, which is the only life there is to live, and which, tonight, felt like exactly enough.